This is a recording for my second RPJ, and I based my second RPJ, and it's reflecting on the term that we've been using as reflection. This does follow on from the first one, I think, because the first one I focused on how to teach a subject knowledge, and an aspect I looked into the first RPJ was how I can reflect on how I've taught that subject knowledge or that knowledge in that classroom, how reflect on what I know about that subject for me to improve on. And since that first RPJ, and really since I've actually started teaching properly in my placement, the idea of reflecting and what it is has really been on my mind, and I thought I'd base this RPJ on it because I feel as if I didn't reflect on this issue of reflection, I probably wouldn't be able to move on from this topic and be able to continue to progress. So this is what this RPJ is based on. Predominantly it's based on the issue of feedback. Feedback to what? That's been the question that's been on my mind. Feedback to what? To myself, or what is myself? And that's sort of the general idea, but we'll go through it together. So I thought I'd use the same method as the first RPJ, using the different forms of knowledge and try to apply it to this reflection. So I started with a belief, moving on from the first RPJ to the second. And so my belief was that reflecting is a situational act and can be detrimental to the development of the professional. This stems from the fact that a lot of what we've been doing in our readings, in the PGC course, a lot of what we've been doing in the workshops has been based on reflection, has been based on the fact that as a professional, if you continue to reflect, you will improve. Well, how? How do you reflect? How do you actually reflect? This is something that's sort of been on my mind a long time. How do I actually reflect? What do I cognitively have to do in my mind to reflect? And a lot of papers sort of flutter around that point. I feel like we get a lot of people who talk about it but actually practically tell you how to reflect. In Harrison, which I will refer to, he references a lot of other articles which I've highlighted in my theoretical analysis, and some do mention how to reflect, but it was just been something on my mind. So this is the belief that I came into this reflection. Funny. And I looked at the authoritative aspect of my knowledge. So where am I getting this from? Well, I'm getting this predominantly from this flowchart that we covered in one of the workshops. And what this flowchart demonstrates is what goes on, what the process is, and how you gain information to then reflect back on it. So as a reflective practitioner, you are absorbing feedback and you are applying it to firstly yourself and then to your classroom practice. And with your own self, that influences your classroom practice. And then this in turn would hopefully, when debates shown whether you can actually prove that you have actually influenced the student in student progress. And there are these two arrows here which show that these in turn will have a feedback effect both to you as a reflective practitioner and you as yourself. I know self-efficacy is doesn't quite mean yourself as you and yourself. However, that's how I've interpreted it, and I feel that's the only best way to interpret this particular block in this flowchart. That is you as you yourself, your attributes and your traits, how you are as your truth. That's how I've interpreted this box. And so with this flowchart, we did cover a couple of the major points about this flowchart in the workshop, but I thought I'd just share some of my initial concerns with it. The key concerns are predominantly around self-efficacy and feedback. And I feel that these two are mutually exclusive, but at the same time are actually linked quite closely in different situations. So in some situations, feedback and self-efficacy can be two completely different things for you to grasp and deal with. How at the same time, if you yourself are feedbacking information to yourself, then obviously these two are inextricably linked. So I had with this knowledge, I started to look at what does it mean in this reflection for professional development. What does it mean in this terminology about yourself? What are people talking about when they mean self-efficacy? Are people discussing how to actually deal with yourself in terms of reflection? So I started looking at within Harrison, Sean, and Sean states, well, via Harrison, Sean argued that if professionals can begin to separate out the things they know when they do them, they will become more effective at what they do. And I thought the point which really struck out to me was when Sean argues to separate out the things they know when they do them. And so essentially what I'm grasping from this quote is that if you being self-aware of your own practice allows improvement. But this requires you to know yourself. This requires that you know who you are, your attributes and your traits, for you to able to make the change that you need to do. And this question of your self and identity, I started looking at, how does our society treat yourself, like the person? And the fact that we're living in a postmodern society, truth is socially constructed. This isn't anything to do with yourself, is it? This is social. It's whatever the others dictate you to be, that is yourself. And that actually, in a classroom setting, can be quite detrimental, because if you take this definition of the self, that you are yourself only for what society has constructed you to be, i.e. your race, gender, or sexuality, or all those aspects, that is yourself. If the society has constructed that for you, or in the classroom setting, if the students dictate who you are, then there's nothing for you to reflect on. That it is out of your control. So that was the first thing that sort of struck to me about the self. And moving on from that, Nias, again in Harrison, refers to the situated identity. So this situated identity in the classroom, it's a persona developed over time, which creates an everlasting, ever-changing you. So what Nias is essentially describing in the quote is that you have a situated identity, and then you have your own identity outside the classroom, and your identity inside the classroom is what you change and reflect on. Well, my concern with that is that this self in the classroom is in constant flux. There is no true self, a foundation for that to build on. Let's say that you're in this classroom, and this refers back to Sean and this postmodern idea of truth. If others dictate who you are, then that is a form of, you have no control of that. So this is in constant state of flux. You will never know whether you will be a good or bad practitioner, because others will dictate whether you are or not. You'll never know yourself. You will always be told. And this is something, again, this leads on from the previous point. And then finally, Rogers, again from Harrison, states, if I can form a helping relationship to myself, if I can be sensitively aware and acceptant of my own feelings, then the likelihood is great that I can form a helping relationship towards others. And so what it seems, how I interpret that quote, is Rogers is saying that if you are sensitively aware of your own feelings, or sensitively aware of yourself, where in that particular state, again, not necessarily referring to yourself, your true self, but a self. So this could refer to what Nias is saying about a situated identity, or yourself in the classroom, which is separate from you. Then you increase the likelihood of you helping yourself and others. Well, my concern with this is that, feelings are subjective, and they can be influenced by other factors. And again, this bounces straight back to this self that is socially constructed or classroom constructed. And if your feelings if your feelings are influenced by others, so if you've had a particularly bad class and you're receiving if the classroom has dictated that you have been a bad teacher that lesson, your feelings are obviously going to be down, and therefore you cannot help yourself nor others in that sense. And so this is almost like a weird toxic circle, which doesn't even which where it's your true self, your true attribute, your true identity is removed from that equation, which I thought could be quite dangerous in a teaching environment, because you'll never actually be able to work on yourself. I keep using that term a lot, but it's just something that's been on my mind. It's can be quite convoluting. So after looking at the theory about feedback and the self, about ourselves and how we should treat these two connections about self-efficacy and feedback, I started looking at, well, what type of feedback am I getting? What type of feedback am I getting in terms of professional feedback and student feedback? So this, in terms of the knowledge, is a combination really it's a combination really of belief, empirical, because it's data which you're essentially collecting, it's notes, it's physical feedback which you can deal with. So professional feedback. So I started wondering, well, does the professional that's given me this feedback also critically reflect on their own practice? And if not, then what improvement can be made in my own development? So I started thinking, well, if I start to receive professional feedback, and if this person doesn't actually critically reflect on their own practice, then what gain is there? If this person isn't improving themselves, then are they on a higher state of professional development than I am? And I'm not trying to be narcissistic, but the reality is, if they're not improving themselves, then what information will they give me which is different from what I'm learning about myself at that point in my development? So it was a bit, not a concern, but it was a thought after reading about feedback and reflection. This is something which I pondered about, and whether the teachers that I'm working with do critically reflect on their own practice. And secondly, another fundamentally important type of feedback, which you hear more often in schools than actual professional feedback, is student feedback. So, if pupils can only feedback what you as a teacher have given them, the pupils are really under your sphere of influence, and so they don't really provide any objective outlook to your practice. So if you're a consistently bad teacher, the students are only going to feedback what you have influenced them in that classroom. So if you're a consistently bad teacher, they're only going to feedback a negative propagation of your teaching. And so I actually think even in schools and in the education system, we focus so much on the student feedback, student progress, and how they're feeling in the classroom. Well, that's great, but it can't be the fundamental factor in your reflection, because it's completely subjective and it's completely under your sphere of influence what the students feed back to you. And so this was this last arrow here, which we covered in the master's workshop. And so with all this in mind, I started to get in the experimental form of my knowledge, I started to use other people's ideas and techniques in the classroom and start applying it to my own practice. So I started to look away from this whole thing about myself, how I try and change myself in the reflective practice, and I started using what other people have objectively seen as an improvement in their own practice, and I've taken that and tried to apply it to my own. And so a case of this would be hinge point questions and hot seat plenary. So these two things, activities, if you could say, so this is sort of an assessment for learning. Hinge point questions, you can see how much the pupils have developed and learned over your lesson. And hot seat plenaries, well, that just sort of gets the keywords covered in a way which people can easily engage with it. So these are examples of reflecting on my own practice and using other ideas to improve on my own practice. This was just what I've been saying. To conclude, this probably sound like very confusing, but to conclude, this journal at this point in my PGC year, I've really started to look at how I am seen in the classroom and in the school, and how I look at myself psychologically and who I am, and how can I improve myself, my true self, rather than creating this other identity to improve my teaching and my practice. Thank you.